Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa, marketing lead at Adina, and you're listening to The Beauty Curtain. This is the podcast that draws back the curtain on the beauty and personal care industry. And today we're super excited to be back with the first episode of season 3. And we have a really exciting guest for you, Jasper. He's the Managing Director of SKUU. They are leading contract manufacturers and they help startups and established brands to create beauty and personal care products that redefine industry standards. So today we're going to get to know Jasper, talk all things UK manufacturing, supply chain, and also how to optimize your relationship with your cosmetic manufacturer. Welcome to the show, Jasper.
Hey Vanessa, thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks for coming on. So, before we dive into kind of the big topics of this episode, I'd love to know a bit more about you and your personal background. So, can you share a bit more about that and maybe your background in the beauty and personal care industry?
Of course, I'm not sure how orthodox it is in the grand scheme of things, but I went to school, as most of us did, and I was desperate to do graphic design at university or something engineering based, but there weren't very many creative subjects that would get me there. So I ended up doing advertising at uni, decided it wasn't for me. I left there and sort of potted around with a few jobs, but I've always loved doing things with my hands and creating things. So when Dad and I decided to set up this business, which was then JLP Cosmetics, it was like a super exciting time. Always been fairly keen to work for myself and sort of do things that challenge what others sort of think you're capable of, I think I'd say. So yeah, that was 7 years ago now. And in that time, we've built an amazing business with about 20 employees. We've gone through a recent rebrand, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a minute. But I think that the last 7 years for me has been such an amazing journey that I've been super privileged to be a part of. But we are only getting started.
That sounds amazing. It sounds like you've scaled up the business massively since the beginning. What has that process looked like and how's it been?
Nothing's super slick and easy. We live in a world of beautifully polished founder stories where things go to plan. But it's important to recognise, especially with contract manufacturing, that the buck certainly stops with us as a business. And we've got, we're like the final line of defence between the brand and the customer, essentially. So we're accountable for an awful lot of things in that sphere. And there's this huge, complex organism going on in the background, from the people that manufacture the raw materials to the people that deliver it. And that's a system where we have to manage that process like all the way through, because if we don't, ultimately something will go wrong. And that usually leads to delays in orders, for example. There's been a lot of challenging times over the last few years, and we've all lived through that. But I think that the excitement for me of sort of being able to build something that I believe to be truly different to what's out there at the moment is, as I said earlier, it is a privilege, really. So I think the excitement outweighs the stress, I'd say.
Well, that's good to hear. So I guess, what is your personal mission within this?
So for my business at the moment, the mission that we've got, which is super clear, is to become the best option for fast scaling skincare brands, the best UK option at least. It's a big world now that's more connected than ever, and we are part of, a catalogue of suppliers, but something that has come to the forefront for us as a bit of a gap is the ability to work with scaling brands and keep up with their growth in a way that means that where possible they're not stocking out, for example, and they're getting great formulations at low time to market. So yeah, the business's objective really is to support scaling businesses, and I think that comes from a really small seed, especially with brands that are emerging right now. But we've seen how fast growth can move, and we've also seen the challenges that people have with their manufacturers in getting stock into them. Stocking out is a huge expense, and it's something that we're actively building our supply chain to avoid.
Okay, I think we'll get more onto that part in a little bit. You mentioned that SKUU works with scaling brands. I think it'd be nice to kind of introduce SKUU, and maybe can you share what sets you guys apart in the industry?
I think the first thing to note is that we are we are a growing business ourselves. So part of the relationship we have with our clients is the understanding that we've been through a lot of these challenges, and we've helped support brands through a lot of the challenges that they're going through, which does make us well placed to stop people stumbling on the same obstacles. Uh, the main thing for us is about reducing lead time and supporting our customers with the the sort of challenges that there are associated with scaling businesses.
Maybe for those who don't know SKUU so well, who are maybe a new kind of indie brand, a startup, can you tell me a bit more about what the role of a cosmetic manufacturer is?
Yeah, of course. So there's lots of different options. We've got things from full service, which is a complete package where you'd usually approach the manufacturer, they'd formulate the product for you, and essentially you get a complete finished product delivered to you or your fulfillment house. There's a wide spectrum of things that come in between that. There's lots of third party formulation houses now. Uh, there's lots of people that just manufacture. There's lots of people that just fill. But for us, it's a little bit deeper than that, and we understand that there's an element of sort of education and support that's required from scaling brands. If you're setting up a skincare business, Vanessa, you don't want to be thinking about the manufacturing. It's the crux of the matter. So our job essentially is to remove that stress where at all possible, and that's something that we're still learning how to do really, really effectively. But it is something that we're set on completely optimizing to remove that work from any founders and their team.
That's amazing to hear. It sounds like the landscape is quite complex. And let's say, as a small brand, it could be quite difficult to navigate. Can you tell me a bit more about how you help them with that process?
Yeah, sure. You're absolutely right. Look, it's a hugely complex thing. If we look at a formulation, for example, we've got like usually a minimum of 15 raw materials, and the likelihood is that they've come from at least 6 different suppliers, and that's just in one case. So you want to be coming to your manufacturer and making sure that they've got a handle on that and they know what's going in the product and that the quality is right every time. That's not something that people always think about, but it is something that exists. And our job really is to try and keep that a little bit behind the scenes. A hot topic for us at the moment is stock management on the customer's side. That's something that when you are scaling really quickly, often isn't a first consideration. There's all these amazing things going on that you need to manage, like team, marketing, um, you know, how where are you getting formulations from, how are you launching new products. But the one thing that very frequently gets overlooked is actually making sure that you don't run out of stock. There's cash flow considerations there, but one drive we're really having at the minute is to support our customers with managing their inventory and their forecasting in a way which essentially means that they've got comfortable amount of stock without having loads of cash sat there on the shelves. That's only one element of this, that's for sure. There's multiple challenges. Shipping is a big factor at the minute, especially when we're exporting. Technical is another aspect that is probably less exciting, but is super important. Anyone that's exporting and in fact selling in the UK has got some hoops to jump through at the moment. So that's an element of our business that is also there to offer support to the founders and the customers essentially. there's a huge spectrum of things. We could sit and list them all day that we offer support with, but the one thing that we see most scaling brands struggling with is stock outs. And in some cases, especially with the rise of things like subscription, that's not something that can just happen. We've got a particular customer, few hundred employees. We provide quite a significant amount of their product, and there's been a very clear understanding from day one that we do what it takes to make sure they don't stock out. And the impact of that event happening is company wide. It's pulling resources from all over. So we understand the importance of working with people on that. But really it starts a bit further down the line, because we can't just, we can't get raw materials in, for example, on super short lead times. So there's always that buffer that we need to try and build into the process.
So firstly, for those who don't know, including myself, what do you mean by stock out?
So it's essentially when you run out of inventory to sell. So there's a few points that can happen in the supply chain. Obviously, if you're selling into retail, it usually means the shelf's empty. Some retailers in the UK especially can charge quite a high penalty for that. But the big problem is that you're not selling stock. So as we mentioned, with subscription businesses, it's a particular problem, because you essentially break a feedback cycle with your customer. So it's something that we have to avoid where possible.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, it's something that I think a lot of brands just might not consider, as a top priority. So would you say this is what sets SKUU apart, is that you offer like a blend of flexibility and forward thinking for your customers?
Yeah, I would say so for sure. I think as well, obviously I mentioned earlier that it's not always considered by people in such a busy environment, but there is also the very real factor that planning for high growth is incredibly difficult. You don't know what's coming in 6 months, and ultimately in some cases you should be ordering stock in that timeline. So that's where the flexibility comes in for us, and why it's so important to our customers.
Onto your customers a little bit, it must be really exciting to work with kind of big brands, smaller brands. What are some of the kind of most exciting projects or briefs that you've worked on so far?
There's a bit of a feeling in our industry at the minute, and I think this is maybe a cultural thing in the UK as well, that things just sort of take the length of time that they take. So one of the things I'm most proud of from SKUU's perspective was working with a personalised skincare customer in the UK who needed to get a product formulated in sort of record time. So we essentially went from brief to sign off in like 4 weeks, and for a completely bespoke product. It's not unheard of, but it's very rare. But from a sort of a manufacturing only standpoint, we've recently installed a gable top carton filling machine. We went through several months of sourcing the right piece of equipment and testing it for one of our customers, which is a good show of our flexibility again. They were already using these packs, but were sort of running out of time to have them manufactured in this certain space. So we brought them on board. We got that piece of machinery set up, and I think it's been a real success story.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you have the flexibility to kind of turn things around in such a quick amount of time, but to also spend the time sourcing packaging options for customers as well. I'd love to pivot to the UK in general and manufacturing in the UK, because it sounds like you've been able to continue being flexible even in this kind of current climate. Can you tell me a bit more about the current climate of manufacturing in the UK?
Yeah, wow, what a question. I think that it's going to become more of a challenge for us as a country, and it's something that I think is incredibly important to the future of the country as well. No one's under any illusion about the amount of product that we import from, not only in the game that we're talking about right now, but across the board. And ultimately, there comes a point where if we don't step in and start really investing in UK manufacturing, we will end up importing almost everything. I think that's a sad place to be, especially given our heritage of certainly sort of high quality manufacture. The culture and the landscape for capitalism, if you like, is changing at the minute, and people are far more price driven than they ever have been. But I do think that the economy needs more UK manufacturing. It's not just a case of being able to export and bring money into the country. It's also about increasing jobs. And I've grown up near Grimsby, which used to be a thriving fishing hub, and it's completely desolate now. And I think that's probably a warning shot. And it's not the only place in the country it's happening. I think that there are things we can do about this, but I do also think that without assistance from the government and people really taking initiative and having to work super hard to get to that point, it is something that will probably continue to die out. And that would be an incredible shame, to be honest. And I think it will leave our country in pretty dire straits as well.
How do you feel that you're innovating your way out of these issues and challenges?
The first port of call for us is offering a superior service. So, there are good manufacturers, certainly of things like equipment now from overseas, and the single biggest challenge, which I think everyone is probably aware of, is the cost difference. We've sourced a few bits of equipment from Asia over the last couple of years, and compared to their European counterparts, in almost every case, they've been about a tenth of the price. And these are pieces of equipment that, we look after really well, we maintain, but you can't justify that price difference. But they've not failed on us, and I think that's been a learning curve for me, certainly. I think the big thing that we can do in the UK to set ourselves apart is continue to up the game for quality and up the game for the way that we're innovating with the products we're creating. Having someone local who is invested in your business as well, which SKUU are, there's not a single one of our customers that we look at as just a number, and that level of care is something that I've found very challenging to get elsewhere.
Do you think startups and small brands will value that kind of care and quality over maybe a price difference? What will keep startups and small brands in the UK?
Absolutely, and we see that, and I'm so proud of the fact that to date I can count on one hand the number of customers that we've lost, because that care and that level of sort of, I guess, emotional investment, you could say, is something that is difficult to find. But when things go wrong, and we live in an imperfect world, our job as a manufacturer is to maintain a level of perfection throughout all of our processes, so that ultimately every single thing that leaves our door is of the standard that our customers and their customers expect. But we do live in an imperfect world, and there's times where things don't go to plan, and actually you need to know that the person selling your product to you is in your corner and in for the fight. And I think that's one thing that has hugely set us apart as a business, is the way that we respond to these challenges, because we don't shy away from them. There's never any passing of the buck, and actually that's something that has stood our customers in good stead and allowed them to just continue and work through problems.
So what makes you so much more flexible?
I think the way that we approach things, ultimately so many things are mindset, right? The understanding of the challenges that people have had when they've come to us for manufacturing help, partly because of the situation that we were under when we started the business and the people we started working with. We've always had a lot of empathy for what the customer needs. We try and make stuff work where we can, where others don't. I think it's as simple as that sometimes.
And actually, on the other hand, do you think maybe startups nowadays looking at sustainability and how a lot of brands kind of want locally sourced ingredients and things like that. Do you think actually startups in this country are looking to manufacture in the UK?
This is something that I'd love to talk about in more detail. Maybe I could come back and we'll do another episode at some point, because sustainability is this huge, complex picture. And yes, to answer your question directly, I think that people are definitely more conscious about having locally manufactured goods. But I also think that there's a picture there that, you know, it's the tip of the iceberg essentially, isn't it? We've got this sort of point at the top where the goods getting manufactured and packed and are going to the customer. And I think that's important for all the reasons I've mentioned above. But I also think that from a sustainability angle, it can be the most efficient way of doing it, but it can also not be. So maybe we could explore that in more detail.
We can definitely explore that in more detail. It'd be great to have you back to chat about that more. So, what then, looking at all of these, everything that you mentioned, all of the drawbacks and challenges of the landscape at the moment, what do you think the future of UK manufacturing is going to look like? And maybe what is your ideal future?
Well, I mentioned high quality manufacturing. I think that as costs go down overseas and continue to rise in the UK, which they're going to, you know, we've seen a multiple pound increase in minimum wage, which I don't think is a bad thing, but ultimately it does put pressure on the price of goods that are manufactured over here, which is why it's important for us to differentiate and really understand what we're about as a country. We can still buy good quality products from overseas, but ultimately I think our thing needs to be just super high quality across everything that we do. And I think that's where we differentiate ourselves. That's where we have the best opportunity for export. UK made is still, you know, it's a quality mark, and I think it's one that we need to invest in more heavily, to be honest. But my other experience with UK manufacturing is that it is a challenging world out there. Huge pressures are put on price because of the competition from overseas, and ultimately, if you're selling to a brand, they need to be making money on top of that. So there's that whole picture to play into. But I think it is so important for our GDP, for our culture as a country, and generally for our self-sufficiency that we don't forget about manufacturing here.
So it's amazing that SKUU are really making a huge effort to continue manufacturing in the UK and to, you know, give higher quality and care to your customers. How do you manage the supply chain? So distributors, everyone who you work with, do you think they're following the same path?
I certainly think some are, and there's a reason I'm sat in your office today. But I do think it's a challenge generally, and I've talked about culture a few times in the sort of second half of this, because I do think that without the culture of why is this taking so long and questioning things, not even questioning things to a point where it's becoming counterproductive or frustrating for your team, but just questioning things and going, is this really necessary that things are going through this process? So one big problem we have, for example, is even getting quotes for raw materials. At the point where we want to add a new raw material to a formulation, or we want to swap something out in our formulation, you know, we want to be able to get a response quickly so that we can make decisions on that. Because ultimately, if we're waiting 2 weeks for a quote on something, which we know full well is a stock item somewhere, that's getting passed on to our customer, and then we've got a small process to get that quote done. I think that because we are in that less commoditized position where we're communicating directly with the brand, in some cases the brand owner, the onus is on us to try and improve that supply chain where possible. And in some cases, it's led us to moving away from suppliers because we're not getting responsiveness, or lead times are getting delayed continuously. So, you know, that all takes a lot of energy out of the business. And I'd love to be in a position in 5 to 10 years where all of our suppliers are sort of on board with this school of thought. Speed and efficiency are not intrinsically linked. I'm aware of that. Just because we're doing something fast, it doesn't mean that it's the most efficient way. But I also think if you build things right, those two things go hand in hand. And I think the challenge probably comes from when we are trying to reverse engineer a system that isn't working properly for speed, and it's not efficient in the first place. And I think that is something that would be my main desire, and is somewhat out of my hands at the minute, but we are working with our suppliers on. And, it's important to our customers, because if we can't get raw materials in for 16 weeks, they can't get product for 16 weeks. And the responsiveness and the flexibility is something that we're building a business on, essentially, and it's important.
So you've mentioned how important collaboration is to SKUU throughout the supply chain. So how do you actually go about doing that for a better outcome?
There's a few different streams to this. The first factor is managing ambition versus execution. Someone I admire greatly used that term to me a few weeks ago, and I thought it was fantastic. It really summarises the dynamic between marketing teams and formulation teams, and building a product which is easy to scale as well, because there are things that we can't work around, and it's important that we're using materials that we can get hold of quickly. So that's the first part, and that comes at the development stage. After that, we're talking with suppliers rather. As I mentioned earlier, the sort of quoting process often takes longer than it should do, really, which often leads to us sort of delaying quotes to our customers. And all these things are okay to tick along in the background sometimes. But the crux is that while we're living in a world of AI and digital, advanced digital technology, we are still sending quotes via email and PDF. And ultimately, while someone's probably generating that price from a database, it's still got a lot of human input. I think that would be a good starting point from a supply chain. If we're talking about forward thinking and what the future looks like, I think there needs to be a way of automating this, because ultimately a lot of these problems come down to equations, especially when we're talking about things like pricing. We're talking about things like shipping routes and getting things to our warehouse as fast as possible when we need them. We spoke about reactive supply chains, and I think that is, for me, the reactivity doesn't come on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't need to be, I send a purchase order, we get goods in 2 days. It doesn't need to be that reactive, but there are times where things just take longer than they need to because the drive's not there to get the job done. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of. And it very much loops back to the UK manufacturing picture, We need to be responsive. I've been out to China a few times last year as an example, and they've got these amazing little sort of micro sort of countries almost, where when you go to the manufacturing districts, you've got a huge steelworks right next to a company that manufactures electronics parts, and in between them you've got various different plastic molding companies, and then there'll be a company that makes machines and a company that makes conveyor belts, and within walking distance you've got 90% of the parts you need to assemble this machine. And we're still, at a point in the UK where we're actually having to import a lot of the components that are needed to do the job properly. And I think that's partly where this is falling down. I'm not suggesting that every product should be 100% UK manufactured, but I do think we've got some work to do to get to a point where things aren't just taking longer than they need to. There's so many occasions where we equipment. We talked about this earlier. You can spec a machine completely bespoke. You can fly out to China and get it tested, sail it back to the UK, and it's still taking 6 to 8 weeks less time than it would from Europe.
So how do we create that more reactive supply chain here?
I think the culture needs to change as a starting point. I don't see a way around that. I think that without an understanding that, we've got this amazing opportunity to keep building UK manufacturing, but we do have to work to it and we have to keep improving. I think it's going to be very difficult to change that picture. Ultimately, I think people will appear and start doing a better job. I can think of a few suppliers that this applies to, and I think that we now favour them because they're proactive and they're fast, and we're not sat waiting for quotes for 3 weeks. But that's got to be the first starting point in my mind, and I think we can think about systems and we can think about processes and all the rest of it a bit later on. But I think the starting point has to be culture.
I think that's great to recognise. But you also mentioned AI and advanced technologies. What is SKUU doing to kind of leverage this new technology to maybe creating that ideal future?
Sure. Well, look, who doesn't use ChatGPT anymore at the minute? That's the first thing. It just saves vast amounts of time, and we're encouraging everyone in the business to use it. But that's not a specific example to this. We've actually just implemented an AI formulation tool, which allows us to. It basically scrapes the web for reviews, feedback, number of sales for individual raw materials. So it looks at a huge amount of large vendors, and it starts to build a picture of what's trending, what's up and coming, and what's on the decline as well. So I'd say that's the main area where we're really harnessing that to turn it into something that is adding lots of value to our customers.
And do you expect throughout the supply chain for all companies to also be harnessing this technology?
I think there's going to come a point where you can't move without bumping into something AI related. We're getting there already, and it's only been prevalent for the last 12 months really. But there is also inherent risk. We've made some mistakes with databases, for example, in the past. We've made some wrong moves there that have caused us a lot of drama. Nothing that couldn't be fixed and nothing that wasn't reversible, but there's a fear factor there when we're starting to look at process innovation and process control, that something could fail on us that could cause a company-wide catastrophe, really. So it's very easy, to summarize. It's very easy to install an AI plugin for a spreadsheet, but it's a far more stressful situation to start implementing that across manufacturing control systems.
It's really interesting for me to hear about the challenges of manufacturing. I think, someone on the street, if you ask them, I don't think they would quite know the level of maybe risk and the challenges that you take on. Do you think there's a lack of understanding of contract manufacturing? Are there any misconceptions that you'd like to debunk?
Oh, I love that question. So, look, it is so complex. Let's paint a picture here. So we've talked about supply chain a bit. We've got 20 raw materials that go into a product. Further down the line from us, there's companies with similar plants that are making the raw materials that go into the product times 20. The raw materials come into us. We've got tight process controls, but it has to be mixed in a way that produces the same product every time, and then it's tested. All of that is done with huge amounts of engineering behind it that are used to create the mixing tanks, are used to create even the simple things that we don't even think about, like laptops. Thankfully, that's not my job, but the ecosystem that's required to get things to a point where they are at an amazing standard for the customer and innovative and ambitious, and actually executable, and then to execute that again and again and again exactly the same, you've got equipment that needs maintaining, and that's made up of thousands of parts in some cases. If something goes wrong on that and you don't hold a spare for it, ultimately you can't run the machine for X amount of time. There's a certain element of pressure that comes from, and quite rightly so, that comes from our customers to deliver. And ultimately, if that pressure wasn't there, I think we'd all be swanning around and chilling out. But it is a hugely complex picture, and I think that we try to protect our customers from that, because that's part of our job. As I said earlier, it's about removing that stress. You want to keep the water nice and crystal clear with your head above it, but underneath you're kicking like a good one. And ultimately that's fine. It's the game we're in, and it is a super enjoyable one, and it's a super high intensity and dynamic thing. But there's times where you guard the customer from the level of stress that is there and is sort of running through your veins at some points on a daily basis. And I'm not saying that our customers, and especially the founders, aren't going through their own stresses, because I know they are. And we know that our job is to try and isolate from that and just keep producing an amazing quality product on time. But yeah, manufacturing's hard. I think that was an Elon Musk quote. It's so hard, is what he said. We're not making cars here. We're making skincare products. But there's a lot of elements.
I think it's great for brands and people in general to understand some of those complexities that you're talking about. Therefore, how can brands optimize their relationship with their manufacturer?
I think there's two important things that can be done or considered. I think the first one is to remember this huge ecosystem that's going into getting the products online and manufactured. And the second one is making it clear from the outset what you expect from them and who's going to be covering which bases. I think they're the two biggest things that I couldn't emphasize enough.
Final question for today. What's the biggest lesson that you've learned in the last 7 years as a contract manufacturer?
For me, it would be that to find the best and most effective solution, you've got to frame the problem in a way which allows you to see it for what it is. And that comes from asking the right questions about the thing that's going on that you're trying to solve or improve on. It's something that we've worked to build into our problem-solving culture across the business, especially in manufacturing, the manufacturing team. Because ultimately, if you can't see all of the elements of something that's playing out, it's very difficult to find a way of remedying it or a way of doing something better. And I think that if you challenge yourself and the way that you're looking at these things, it's a huge advantage. Don't take things on face value all the time, and that goes for both the issues that we encounter and the general way that we all operate, without wanting to get too sort of existential about it. I think that would be my biggest learning.
I think that's a good place to end this episode. Thanks so much for joining us, Jasper. And I hope you can join us for another episode, maybe to build on your points of sustainability, maybe the future of manufacturing and trends, something like that.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. It's been a lot of fun. I'll see you next time.
Amazing. Thanks so much for watching this podcast. Thank you to Harrison for producing it. All the information about SKUU, everything you need will be in the description box down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll see you in the next one.